So welcome to all of you who've joined us or are settling in for our second online public seminar on cities here at the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary. We're hosting today's event along with the City Centre and speaking, it looks like, to an audience tuned in from across the UK and beyond. I suspect no small part of the reason may be our speaker for today, and I'm delighted to welcome Richard Sennett to the IHSS. For fully 5 decades, Richard has produced an incredible body of work pertaining to the social life of cities, of labour and class relations and sociology. His books include such classics as The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, The Corrosion of Character, The Craftsman, and most recently, Building and Dwelling. He's been the president of the American Council on Work and was the founder of the New York Institute for the Humanities. Richard's work is a style all of its own. He links broad sociological themes across the span of history with intimate portrayals of particular communities, classes, and individuals. His book, Flesh and Stone, was the first piece of essayistic sociological writing I ever read, long before I'd even heard the name Michel Foucault, with whom Richard collaborated, and when I was young enough to be particularly fascinated by what the ancient Greeks did with their spare time, all richly documented in that book. Richard's writing has the unique ability to be both intellectually and politically diagnostic, while also keeping things sociologically as open as possible. And if there's a single theme where these attributes are needed, then surely the interaction between climate and cities is that theme. Cities, as they emerge in Richard's writing, are like great bellows of history, segregating and bringing people together, struggled over by social groups, but always creating spaces, circulations and openings for warmth, heat and life. Climate change is itself intimately connected to cities, of course. They account for as much as 75% of all CO2 emissions, but they're also uniquely vulnerable to its effects. Cities cannot be moved, they represent long embedded infrastructure, they exist beneath the level of the national political scale, but are too large to be captured by any singular agenda, and no one city is the same. This is in many ways the problem of the city as an environmental actor, and I look forward to hearing Richard's comments on this shortly. Before asking Richard to speak, let me first introduce my co-chair for today, Dr. Regan Koch. Regan directs the City Centre here at Queen Mary. He's a senior lecturer in geography and an urbanist of note, and will offer an initial response to Richard's comments before we open up to questions from the audience. When the time comes, if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the chat facility on the Blackboard interface. Regan and I will both be monitoring, and we will be able to pose your question to Richard. Please therefore include your full name and affiliation when writing your question. You should all be muted until then, but please make sure now that your sound and video alike are off so we can be certain to avoid any technical glitches. And you'll find the control panel for all of those facilities on the right-hand side of your screen. And with this, I'll hand over to Richard, who I gather will speak for around half an hour or so. One of the elements that is less well known, relatively speaking at least, about Richard is his long-standing engagement with the United Nations. Richard currently serves as Senior Advisor to the United Nations on its programme on climate change and cities. And it's in relation to this work that he'll be talking to us today, specifically to the title, Mitigation or Adaptation, Hard Choices for Cities. It's always a delight to hear a trusted voice take on a new topic. So Richard, with much anticipation, I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I am going to talk to you today about work we're doing at the UN on this relation between cities and climate change. But I'm going to speak on my own behalf rather than give you institutional boilerplate. So all the mistakes I make are my own. And I look forward to your comments. I want to start by a very depressing figure, which is a cast iron, or as they say in academia, robust prediction of how the world will be using energy 15 years from now. We've been working on this for it took 2 years actually to produce this chart. And as you can see from this, what's depressing about it is, despite all the talk about transformation of energy sources for the world, the renewables constitute only about 14% of what, based on present trends, we think energy mix is going to look like in 15 years' time. The sinners, that is coal, oil, and an even greater sinner, natural gas, dominate the picture of energy use. So it sets a frame for thinking about how to approach, as I say, a cast iron reality like this. It's something that should be combated, but the amount of political action that would be required to, say, change the renewable number from 14 to 23% is incredibly difficult. So that's the framework, and we're looking at what do we do given the fact that this is the way global capitalism is going to furnish us our energy. How can we combat this on the ground? I would love to have a socialist revolution, but I don't know. Maybe for younger people that will come. I don't think I'll live to see it. But the issue is, what can cities do on the ground given this reality? I'll share with you one thing that we're doing that will frame this about climate problems and their effect on cities. I hope I can make this thing work. Let me just move on here. An issue that really concerns us is desertification. Oh, by the way, I just show you this slide. If climate change goes up 4 degrees, this is the likely effect in Britain. I find this is the only cheery image that in the 7 years that I've been doing this work that I can see. It means that all the MPs will have to abandon Parliament, get into canoes, and try to conduct their business on the Thames. And of course, we hope that they would all capsize and drown. But it's anyhow. That's what London would look like if 4 degrees of warming, which could happen in about 35 years. But what I want to show you is something about this. Oftentimes, when we think about cities and climate change, we focus on things like pollution, which is quite right to do, about cycling in lieu of driving cars, also right to do. But in the global south, where I and my colleagues do most of our work, there is a kind of antecedent problem that haunts us, which is not what's happening in cities, but what's happening outside of them in the larger environment. Specifically, what is happening is a process of desertification, which is spreading across much of the world, and which is already, but will begin to drive people into cities. So this is a problem where migration, with all of its politics, crosses over with heat. And I'm going to try and make that palpable for you in this way. I'll skip this. I do a lot of work in Somalia. And in Somalia, if you look at the little bar chart on the right, you'll see, you know that Somalia is has lots of civil unrest, lots of warfare going on within the country. But the reasons, most reasons for displacement, for the refugees that we need to deal with, are drought, far more than even this war-torn country. And I'll show you why that is. Here is a well in Somalia. I photographed this about 6-7 years ago. And you can see that people are staring, kids I was working with staring down into the well. And it's surrounded by vegetation. It's an arable, not by British lights, but by Somalian lights. It's an arable piece of land. Here's what's happened to the well 2 years ago. The water table went way down as heat conditions in Somalia and the Sahel more largely began to alter. And that produced this landscape. What I've done is turn the camera around from looking backward this way to looking outward. That's what it looked like last summer. Now, that's what desertification is about. And its effect on cities is the following. This problem in the Sahel of desertification is, you can see it with the red lines and with the cities in countries where it's impacting most. The result of this is that desertification is that many of these people, we estimate that desertification by 2050 is going to produce about 120 million climate refugees in the Sahel, and that about 40% of them will be driven into these red dot centers, which are themselves losing water because of this climate change, and that the other 60% are going to head towards Europe. So you know what, in 2015, what kind of a crisis, right-wing crisis, was sparked by the movement of about 1,700,000 refugees from the Middle East into Europe. Multiply that by 30. When you have, say, 35, 36 million people who are fleeing from desertification and who are seeking refuge in Europe. The political consequences would be incredible in general, but the consequences in cities are going to be particularly marked because most of these people will not head to the countryside, but they will, because of the way trade routes work for migrants, will head into cities. So that's our fear. What can we do about it? We, the UN, can do very little except for one thing. We can change the rules for who is considered a migrant and who is considered a refugee. A UN convention written in 1951 distinguished between refugees and migrants. Refugees are people who have a well-founded fear of persecution if they return to their homelands, whereas migrants are people who are seen to have more choice in moving. But there is no choice about moving back there. It's meaningless. You could choose to die of thirst. So what we're trying to do is find ways to give, we have very little resources, but to give people standing, at least, and access to the resources we have as as refugees rather than migrants. And we're finding some cities in Europe are very receptive to that. That is, that people arrive with papers and they have a reason to be there, which is explicable and documentable. So, and we're working this out with places you would be surprised at. Marseille, supposedly a hotbed of right-wing populism. Barcelona, you would expect that more. Naples, again, supposed to be a hotbed of right-wing populism. It's, I think, the urban reality of desertification is that it's easier to cope with the needs of refugees, to entitle them to things like basic income support or to language education than it is to people who are seen to have come voluntarily and so could leave and go back somewhere else. So that's a big picture for us about migration and desertification. This is it's a very UN-centric view of what we might do to help, but it's a significant piece of help by giving people kind of legal standing as they move to cities. Now I'm going to come on to what I wanted to talk to you about before. So much of this, which is interesting, which is this relation between mitigation and adaptation in climate change. And it sort of bears a little on mitigation and adaptation in the current pandemic to COVID-19. I'm trying to work that out with my team in terms of stuff you'll see. Mitigation is an attempt to push back against climate change. And adaptation is basically an attempt to deal with its consequences. And I'm going to show you two really extreme versions which make a contrast where there should be a cooperation between the two. In terms of what happened to New York after Hurricane Sandy. The city was 8 years ago overwhelmed by an enormous hurricane, which bridged most of the defenses in Lower Manhattan. It was supposed to be a one-in-a-century event. Because of climate change, things like that are not one-in-a-century events. In fact, the year after, the New York region suffered as severe a hurricane 1 year later, which missed the city but had devastating effects elsewhere. And it's one, you can see that in Russia today. You know that the Siberia is experiencing heat wave. People say we've never seen anything like this, but it will probably be something the Russians will see again. Anyhow, I'm going to show you two extreme approaches to mitigation and adaptation in after Hurricane Sandy. The first, both of them are attempts to build berms, which are pile-ups of rubble and sand to break the force of the tidal wave coming in during during a hurricane or any extreme weather event, and even more to protect the city, the place, from the sucking back of the wave when it recedes. That's a real danger, as in Fukushima in Japan. The energy force of attack is great, but the sea takes back its when it takes back its water, it actually exerts a greater pull on the environment that it's receding from. In New York, there were two proposals about this. This is a proposal by Bjarke Ingels' firm, modestly titled B.I.G, to build a berm around all of southern Manhattan, a huge 18-foot, nearly 5-meter, well, it's 18.9 feet, necklace around southern Manhattan to protect all those buildings which were inundated by water before. It's based on the notion that if doing your sums right, that you can build your way out of climate change. As it happens, all those sums calculations were wrong, because in the wave that struck, the storm that struck New York the year later, the waves were higher than the calculations indicated using the past, and had the storm struck New York and this necklace was built, the effect would have been to overtop and decimate the berm. So, but it represents the desire to build yourself out of climate change, and that is mitigation at the extreme. Here's an alternative proposal done by colleagues of mine at MIT, and the idea here is to build berms, but build them not where the storm is going to strike, but on the edges of the strike surface, so that when that sucking motion comes, that the berm, which is planted, will lessen the sucking motion back into the sea of the storm. In other words, you're attacked, but you lessen the effect of climate change on the city by plantings and other ways of dealing with the sides of the city, the sides of where the storm would come, so that there's less damage. Those are extremes. In the third world, a construction like a berm, or like what I'm going to show you now, is simply not possible because we don't have the dough. We haven't the money. This is the best storm surge barrier in the world, built in Rotterdam. It took 45 years to build, and we haven't 45 years. We need to do something now. Here's the other part of it. Whereas an adaptive way of dealing with storm surge is this house by Rem Koolhaas, which sits on pontoons and just rises when the water rises. I'm thinking about, I'm going to skip this, about small scale ways in which are quick to do, in which we can combine mitigation and adaptation. And I am a big fan of something called Koolseal. And basically what this is a way of decreasing heat and conserving water in cities. It is not a storm surge proposition, but it's about the notion of cities heating up themselves. Koolseal, I don't own any stock in this company, is a water-based titanium infused white material that you spread on street surfaces and on the tops of buildings. Most street surfaces are black, they're macadam, which means that they absorb heat during the day and keep it at night and they become like little storage heaters, which help heat cities up. If you've ever wondered why Greek cities mostly are painted white, it's because the attempt in that very cunning, simple way is to, instead of make dark buildings, make these heat-repelling white buildings. And so I and my team are looking at how we can use materials like Koolseal to it is a mitigation in a sense, but it's also an adaptation to an existing condition, which is things are going to get hotter. Here's what it looks like in Los Angeles, which is a leader of Koolseal. Here's my guys are applying it to a rooftop in Bronx, New York, very poor area. And it's over a building which has no air conditioning. So this is their air conditioning. And here is a combination of spreading Koolseal and creating bioswales, which are bioswale is basically a cistern planted with plants like the plants you saw in the MIT proposal, which can be which can live in water. These plants clean water. So whenever there's rain in Los Angeles, which got a lot of acid rain, these plants conserve it and clean it at the same time, and it goes into the gray water system of the city. So that's a kind of small scale version of dealing with adaptation and mitigation combined. I want to finish by just, you can do the same thing with plants. This is the Oasis Hotel. I want to, this is behavioral change. I'm not going to go through this. I am nearly a vegetarian, but I don't want to go through that with you. I want to end by saying that, and this is where I think there is a relation to COVID, that for a long time, culturally, we've had the notion that we can master nature. In Renaissance, this was a notion of the cornucopia, that nature can be mined, it can be, its forests can be cut, it is an endless source of giving to human beings, which can never be exhausted. Similarly, in medical practice, the notion was that diseases could be, and it's the first time in 1718 that this word appears, diseases could be conquered, as though they were like subalterns who could be enslaved, or colonial subjects who could be controlled. It's an attitude towards the natural world which is not interactive, but in which the domination of nature becomes the subject for human invention. And I think what we've arrived at now in the modern world, with climate change particularly, is that this image of the cornucopia no longer works. That nature is not a cornucopia. It can be exhausted, as it is exhausting itself currently in water tables throughout the Sahel. And that it's not a subaltern subject, as we're seeing in COVID, which is, has its own, Bruno Latour talks about it as kind of bioagency. It has its own bioagency. We may have to live with it rather than going to war with it, as Donald Trump wants to do, and defeating it so that it becomes our slave. So I think the problem that we face is how to make moves like the move that in both climate and in COVID, which are immediate things like the Koolseal, which are actions we can take without thinking that we're going to dominate a problem, but we're going to work with it. And that's particularly true in cities. So that's what I have to say about this. As I say, these are my thoughts. I am a UN official, but these are not official thoughts. And I'd very much like to get your responses.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for those thoughts. I mean, it's really interesting, some of the things you've been saying there, and the question, I mean, mitigation or adaptation is really one of the crucial challenges that we face right now. You know, it's a brave man that tries to take on that question, and it's great to see some of the ways that you've been doing it. I mean, I think there are a number of disciplinary responses one could make to this, and there's also a number of practical and political responses that you can make. I know certainly some of what you were saying raised a few queries that sparked my thinking in relation to some of your early work as well. But before I raise those, I think I want to give over a bit of time to Regan, who's going to jump in and offer a few immediate responses to your really interesting talk. And then I'll come back. And by the way, for those of you who wouldn't have been aware, my name is Simon Reid-Henry. I'm the director of the IHSS. And I forgot to say that at the start because I was being attacked by a wasp who is as hot as I am. So apologies for that, but now you know who I am. But I'll shut up again briefly for a few minutes and let Regan take over and put a few questions back to you, Richard. So thanks, Regan.
Great. Can you hear me, Richard?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. There's a lot to digest and to think about. And like Simon, I've long been inspired by your work, particularly on the social life of cities, the way that public cultures are forged and potentially flourish or erode, and the role of planning in developing sort of open cities or closed cities. And what really strikes me the last 5 or more years of your work is how climate change has forced you and forced all of us to think beyond the city, to think about transnational networks and international institutions and global scale problems. And yet your work seems to insist on a privileging of the city as a locus for action, as you were talking about here, but also as a key point in the politics of a common good, in imagining a kind of shared existence. And that, seeing those dotted bands around the Sahara made me really think about the urgency in which we think of not only our own city, but cities as a formation, as a real locus of action and a locus of common good. And I was thinking about a number 5 years ago or so, arguing that city.
I'm sorry to say you're breaking up.
Kinds of ideals for the idea that the. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to ask. One of the first questions I wanted to ask about then was just.
Sorry, Regan. I think we've lost you then briefly, Regan. Would you be able to kill the video, Regan, so we can just have you on audio?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Check.
Can you hear me now, Richard?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering, what are some of the greatest obstacles to keep cities from being leaders internationally? You know, you're calling for greater urban representation at the UN. What's holding back cities from leading internationally? And also, what are some of the risks inherent to that? Sorry.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's a specific and a general issue. For us, the specific issue is that the UN is composed of nation states, that cities have no representation in the US. A few have observer status, but that's only because of special relations they have to us as an organization. And so we are engaged in a huge righting of the UN ship so that it focuses less on nation states and more on urban governance and on urban institutions generally. More largely, I'd say that that reflects a problem in that, if you like, that the interests of cities are not well represented in at the national level. Certainly in the countries we deal with, like India or Somalia or Myanmar, that the elites are not elites that are formed around issues of urban governance, certainly not around bottom-up activities in cities. A lot of community-level stuff is disempowered at the national level. And so basically, there is a kind of crisis between the city and the nation in terms of most nations are mostly now urban, but their structures of power are not attuned to what cities themselves need, certainly not from bottom-up kinds of communal bases of cities. You can see that in the COVID crisis in Brazil, which is, you've got a lot, we're seeing a lot of this, a lot of activity at the communal level in favelas and even in slightly more bourgeois neighborhoods. But the access to national resources of these local networks is very poor. They're disempowered, and that's one of the reasons that COVID thing is spreading so wildly in Brazil. So there, I would say that the basic answer to your question is that this conflict between city and nation, in which the nation state holds all the cards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thinking with that question, Richard, do you think city governance or city government needs to change in light of climate change? Or is there a need for new kinds of institutions or new modes of governance that can both reach up and reach down, as it were? And are you seeing those in your work?
Well, I would say in London, for instance, where boroughs are have a problem really in getting citywide resources. They that they're disempowered because city itself doesn't have many resources to give them. So bottom up, you know, pretty soon hits the equivalent of a glass ceiling. I mean, I think the problem we have in Britain is an extreme of centralization. And under the I'm speaking personally here, what strikes me about Tories is that they're very against things like full welfare state and you know, commons and so on, but they're extreme centralizers. So that they don't want much responsibility for government, but they want a lot of government control, central control. That's obvious again in the COVID crisis, where at the urban level and the community level, there are all sorts of resources for doing tested tracking. But Boris Johnson isn't interested in that. He's interested in centralizing the operation. So, you know, that's a problem. We need to rebuild ways in which cities can respond to communities in an effective way with cash and with real control. And we are living in a country in which cities are the engines of the economy, but they are disempowered, in my view.
Okay, maybe one more question from me, and then we can think about widening the conversation up just a bit. But you've mentioned COVID-19 sort of in passing a few times, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what has social distancing taught us about adaptation and flexibility and sudden change? And have you seen positive signs of a new attitude towards openness or experimentation that we might be able to think forward with?
Did you bring a sleeping bag? I'd say just very briefly about this, that the easy journalistic answer to the relation between cities and COVID change and COVID-19 was that density was the enemy of the disease, and therefore we have to disaggregate cities. People have to flee, they have to go away, even though that would be economically its own kind of catastrophe. That's wrong. We could build cities so that their forms are more flexible. That is, that a pandemic comes and goes, it changes its shape from month to month, as we know. That when people need to socially distance, say in taking mass transport, that the activities that they engage in can be decentralized. And rather than shutting down every pub and cafe in the country, you would have maybe shut down the pubs and cafes that people travel to. That offices could be shut down, but since there's a glut of office space in the UK, that people would have found temporary accommodation closer to where their workers are. There are lots of ways of dealing with, the error is to equate density with crowding and overcrowding. At the urban design level, what the pandemic suggests is that we need to have much more flexible structures, much more adaptable structures that can breathe just the way we want to breathe. By that I mean that rather than building a tower block in which everybody is confined to one rigid kind of structure, you build a housing estate which has all sorts of different kinds of forms and whose internal configurations of walls can be changed so that families can self-isolate if they need to and then come together when they don't. But the easy journalistic thing about this is that somehow cities are unhealthy. And I think that's really lazy thinking. So one of the things, and I just published a book with a colleague of mine, a young colleague of mine, Pablo Sendra, called Designing Disorder, which is how to make flexible spaces which can be refigured as things go on. I'll plug this book. It's very cheap. Verso publishes it. But we're trying to look at exactly how you get this kind of flexibility in dealing with a health crisis.
And it seems there's a wider question there, maybe just at a more societal or everyday level. How do we learn to cultivate more open ways of living, or know, an open disposition to flexibility, something that you've dealt with in earlier work, not around climate change, but around living together, perhaps.
Right. Well, the sociological part of this is, in fact, how do people become sophisticated in dealing with difficulty? And, that's something that you have to learn as a behavior. And in my prior work, I've been, how do people learn to deal with complexity and challenge? And a lot of my prior work is about what are the sociological conditions that in which people learn how to deal with difference or with difficulty, frustration, with limits. And that isn't, I don't think that's architecturally determined in any way. I think that's a whole different set of problems about the way in which our society is brutal, making things brutally simple. And capitalism has a great interest in making things brutally simple. But I do think that as people become more able to deal with complexity socially, that we should have an environment which enables them to practice that kind of complexity and flexibility. And that's what my book, Building and Dwelling, or this Designing Disorder book, and certainly the work I'm doing at the UN is about.
Thanks, Regan, for those additional comments and thoughts, and Richard for your further reflections on them. We've got a few questions that have cropped up in the chat, which I'm going to come to in a minute, and just to remind people that you've got an opportunity to enter in a comment or a question there, and we'll bring that into the discussion. But just while people think about that a little bit, I wanted to raise a point about that last comment around the need to be flexible and to live with things. I mean, that's really what COVID presents to us. We're in a period before a vaccine where there is no choice but adaptation. It's about which choices we make within that particular paradigm. But I'm sort of struck by the parallel, if you like, with a comment that I think it was Brian Barry once posed to John Rawls about his original position, which is within the original position, you have no choice but to be a utilitarian. And I wonder whether we are in a similar position here, where within this mode of adaptation or flexibility, we have no choice but to also live with the power structures that we inherit at that point. And so I really, Richard, wondered if you could just say a little bit more about power and the way it operates both within cities. And here I was really struck by your picture of the Berm in New York and the planning for it. And I have to say the figure that came to mind when I saw that was Robert Moses. And I just kind of thought, you know, here is another mega structure set up within a city that's possible, whether it's an expressway or a park or whatever, that captures people's desire for freedom, for flexibility, and imposes on them a vision that serves another purpose. And so my concern around some of the sort of the potential solutions, and of course this would be the case whichever solution one comes up with, it's inherent to the nature of creating solutions, is the power relations that will be involved within it. And that, I think, is both something that happens within cities, but also presumably at some level, going back to your earlier comments around where cities are positioned as kind of political entities, between cities as well. You know, and here I'm thinking of, you know, the way in which something like UN Habitat has operated over time, founded in 1978, largely independent, really addressing before anybody else was the questions of mass urban growth, but without a voice until it became a part of the UN system. And as it's done that, it's gained an agency, but it's also lost perhaps some of the original politics that was behind the vision of bringing mayors together around the world. So both on the kind of the within city and the between city element, it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts about how power, you know, raw, naked power plays into this of the Robert Moses variety. Well,
another huge question. I would say simply that a lot of the thing that's disturbed me about a lot of mitigation strategies is that they're top down, that they're imposed, and what attracts me to adaptive strategies is that they're more practicable by communities. There is a problem of coordination. You can't have an adaptive strategy to an electric grid. You know, that does need to be imposed top down. But I think on balance, this distinction between mitigation and adaptation is between two systems of power. On COVID-19, I think what people are forgetting about this is that we have a pretty strong safety net in this country. We have the NHS. I know you can complain about it, but it's pretty impressive. in places like India or Brazil, that safety net is really weak. And so it's not a matter of top-down power or bottom-up power as alternatives. People have to do for each other what the state can't do for them. In Delhi, for instance, where my group is tracking things, we're seeing people be quite innovative about using social network technology, so that since there are very few doctors available, that people can say, oh, Mrs. Maida around the corner has self-isolated and she's going to need food for the next 14 days. That's not an alternative to a top-down power or to a central system of support. So in that case, I think the issue is not the roles in one of who has the power, but that there's an absence of power, which has to be filled by these adaptive strategies.
Yeah, exactly, and will be filled, right? I mean, and actually that's a great point on which to bring in a first question here from our audience, which is from El Dunst, joining us from Germany. And so the question here is, which city or cities come to your mind for best practices in integrating climate change and mitigation and adaptation, and why? So really, this, where are some of these solutions really emerging?
Copenhagen is a leader in this in Europe, for obvious and not so obvious reasons. It's the obvious reasons are all those bicycles. The non-obvious one is that it's used tech to give people more information about how the energy in the city is being used. You can actually tap into the water levels of different water tables of different parts of Copenhagen by certain kinds of apps. It's a very progressive way of enabling citizens to practice climate change, and so to me it's the gold standard. Curiously enough, in Latin America, although it's very menaced by COVID at the moment, Curitiba in Brazil is also a leader in doing this for exactly the same reason, which is that the issues about transport, where there's too much crowding, it's sort of is all distributed in social networks so that people can access it, and people can make decisions because they use tech to make them about community investments in different kinds of climate change things. There are some neighborhoods in Curitiba which are into Koolseal, and others which are into solar panels. So, that's the kind of thing you want, is where you don't have a best practice, but you have lots of practices. It's like having a lot of arrows in a quiver, that there are lots of best practices to resort to, which are based on people's participation. And so I would point to those as two outstanding examples.
Yeah, fabulous. That's really interesting, Richard. There's a question here now from Connor Maloney, or it begins with a comment, actually. And it says, I note the focus on technically led solutions and less attention to behaviorally and culturally led approaches. Common problem, I think, in discussing sustainability. One alternative approach that he points to here is that of bioregional co-founder Puran Desai, who talks about relaxing into a different way of living. He and Sue Riddlestone developed the One Planet Living framework as a holistic approach to how we're going to live together happily and healthily within a fair share of the Earth's resources. 19th century echoes of that as well. But the question here that comes out of it then is this: historically, there were 40 years of attempts to solve the problem of sewage in the Thames, which came to nothing until the Great Stink of 1858, when the Houses of Parliament became uninhabitable, a little like your picture. When and how will the elites be viscerally affected to the extent that they are sufficiently motivated to act? I mean, I think this does touch on a theme that kind of ran through your talk, Richard.
Yeah, this is a very good question. I wish I knew the answer. If there were some tipping point that would finally wake them up. I had the terrible experience last year. We organized the General Assembly. We got 63 countries to declare climate emergencies. I don't know if you remember that. The result of which was that most of those countries appointed a commission to study the problem. Yeah. That's elite behavior, and the notion is also always that elites can escape what others can't. You see that again in the COVID thing. You can't pick up garbage on your computer, but you can if you're a middle-class person. You may be able to work from home. So I wish I knew that. I want to say about his first observation that this is just in my own biography. I am a sociologist, and I guess a kind of I've written sociology as literature because I'm interested in people's experience. But when I got into this subject, I realized that I needed to be much more technologically minded than I was. I quit my job at the LSE and went to work at MIT and so on. I've probably gone too far in the other direction now. I'm really interested in infrastructures, built environment questions. You can see that from my book, Building and Dwelling. I'm certainly not a technological determinist, but I think a lot of people with a kind of humanities formation like me we focus almost obsessively on who's in control, who has the power, how do we resist, and so on, in dealing with cities, and not enough about something that's not enough. We don't get out of the kind of pornography of power that often takes over our minds. So I mean, I'm saying I'm quite old, but I just when I retired and went to work full-time for the UN, was very much on my mind that I'd been too much in this kind of in the realm of urban culture and not in the realm of kind of the solidity, as you say, of cities, their infrastructures, their technology, and so on. So I probably overdo this at the other end now.
But I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? When you've written before, because I was going to ask you earlier whether what had changed about your thinking by being confronted by very different types of cities to the ones that you had studied for much of your career until then. And but you've written about craft, and there's a craft aspect to technology and an element of it that isn't the individual one, but a collective one. And so so I think there are definitely resonances between the two approaches, right?
Well, there's a craft aspect even in something as seemingly simple as Koolseal.
Yeah.
That is, how do you put it down? Who puts it down? How do they do it effectively? And most of all, how do they cooperate with each other to get it down? Once this is a community effort rather than something that's outsourced to a firm, the experience of actually doing something with your environment, which is a real community building thing. That's what we saw in doing this in the Bronx, whereas in Los Angeles, it's outsourced to a private firm. They make money off of it. The community gets a technological benefit, but not a sociological one. And because this stuff is so cheap, one strategy thing that I'm interested in is how we can develop more technological tools like that, which people can deploy as craftsmen working with each other, how this is kind of atelier situation. I mean, there's a real limit to this. I'm under no illusions about the degree to which this is going to deal with climate change. you know, dealing with climate change means revolution. You know.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's been one of the interesting things about COVID. You know, how do you stop stuff? Well, stop. You know. But I mean, so well, this partly links with a question here from Olivia. She pushes you to talk about Foucault, but I'll let you off that, given what you've just been saying. But she also says, can you please just? She also says,
40 years ago, so.
Can you please discuss a bit about, I suppose, the relationship here is what she means between individual freedom and collective consciousness when it comes to, you know, combating these large-scale, borderline existential crises like climate, COVID, and so forth.
Well, the problem is precisely making that distinction. I'm often asked when I talk to the general public, what can I do, you know, to combat climate change? And the answer is you can't do anything alone. It's very true, you could eat less meat, you could get towards a vegan condition. But unless millions of people do that, it's not going to make much of a difference. And the notion that agency lies in the individual, I hear it all the time, that, you know, I want to make a difference. That is the wrong way to frame this problem. It can't be dealt with by virtue signaling, for instance. You can feel good about it, but it won't make any difference. So it's precisely that distinction I would challenge.
Great, interesting, and it's the problem of free riding as well, isn't it? As you
yes,
suggest.
Absolutely.
So that gives us a slightly more innovation tech peg to a question here from Bettina Hubert, who says, in a world where innovations/solutions usually come from the global north in a one-way manner, what is your personal experience working in and from the global south then? What can we learn from mitigation and adaptation?
That's a fabulous question. And that question should be extended to everything about cities. You know, it's the only way to reverse kind of colonialist mentality about many aspects of cities. But about climate change, and in particular about desertification, obviously the kind of very clunky solutions that that are imposed by things like desalination plants, that's a northern idea, are less innovative than what Berber tribesmen do. For instance, conserve water day in and day out, and how they dress, and when they hydrate themselves, and so on. And just talking about behavior, that the one thing that has really struck me since I sort of made this change in my life is, I would say, how much more adaptively sophisticated people are in places where they don't have many material resources. It struck me the first time I went into in Medellin, into a barrio in Medellin. It's absolutely clean, and the reason was that nobody throws anything out. They're adaptively using stuff. You know, there is trash that is taken away, but the trash use is very much restrained. And the reason for that is they're very sophisticated users, because they can't afford a lot. When we look at something like the fact that in the world, 32% of all the clothes people buy, they throw out. That's a global north attitude about the cornucopia, which would never be true in places like a Delhi slum or a favela in Brazil. So if your questioner is asking me this personally, that's what really struck me, that the less people have, the better practitioners of climate change they are, and with each other, because they share a lot more.
Yeah, and I think Richard, there, I mean, there's a temporality element to this question here too, and I'm sure Bettina's sitting at the end of the screen throwing things at it because I didn't add this bit in, but because out of what you've just been saying now, which is really about whether the capacity to respond quickly. I mean, you were again mentioning it was a really interesting fact: 45 years to build the protection in Rotterdam. And you don't have 45 years on this scale. So what can one do that's fast, that's quick and effective? I mean, I remember studying, I did my PhD in early studies on Cuba, and that's often another place that is resource poor, but but innovative and able to create all sorts of sustainable solutions in ways that are harmonious and are viable over time and quick.
And quick. And we know that their medical prowess is incredible. Unfortunately, the Cubans are not let into our country, and so that's the other part of that story. That a lot of this kind of material sophistication and craftsmanship that people without material means have is invisible to wealthy societies. It's true in building, just the way it is in medical realm. A lot of them,
definitely, and I had the intellectual gaze, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, that was something that really struck me in working in so-called informal settlements in Africa, that the people are actually incredibly skilled craftsmen in using things like plastic sheeting, metal sheets, unmortared concrete blocks, and so on. They're far more sophisticated than the kind of building we do in Britain at the materials level. But don't you think that as a large frame for all of this, that what we're seeing is that as we have to make do with less, that's a consequence of the cornucopia, that the distinction between developed and underdeveloped is going to absolutely disappear. That this was the notion that the West set up a kind of model of modernization with this extraction of resources, with this notion of treating the rest of the natural world as a cornucopia, that we're over that. It's finished. Climate change has drawn a big line under the distinction between developed and developing, third world and first world. And I think that's going to be a huge change in consciousness. It's already started in a way in COVID. There are many very poor societies that have dealt with this pandemic far better than Britain. Who's the underdeveloped one? Is it Boris Johnson, or is it somebody like this wonderful Prime Minister of New Zealand, which is quite a poor country, who has managed it more brilliantly? I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of unsettled notions about what it means to be developed, which are going to be coming out now, and I think even more with climate change.
Yeah, I think so, and I mean, since you asked the question, I mean, one thing that has broken it down is capitalism itself. I mean, it creates the problem of climate change. It creates the problem of a north and a south, as you used to say, a rich and a poor world. But it also creates now a scenario of, I mean, in terms of inequality or however else you want to manage it, where actually the national sovereign husk is not necessarily the divide that matters. You have greater inequality between countries, within countries, than you do between them, whether it's Brazil, the US, or so forth. So, and this is why I think cities become such an important locus for so much of this politically and sociologically, because this is where those questions are going to be worked out, and it comes back a little to the point about how urban forms of municipal government or whatever it would be will or won't join up in ways that can address what are common problems but differentially experienced.
Well, I would think of it also in a more visceral way, that the exposure to difference in a city is something that happens physically. It's the cultural gift of density, that you're with people who are physically different, you're physically with people who are different from you by class, race, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nation state is a way of dematerializing that experience. One of your questioners asked me about Foucault. Had he lived longer, Foucault was thinking of doing a book on cities for that. You know, he did this whole book on the history of the body and sexuality. Sexuality. It's really a history of the body. But he was interested in exactly at the end that kind of problem, which is what does physical presence mean to experience of our own bodies and sexuality? And I mean, that's why I think we should teach less national history and more urban history, because it's the history of people actually experiencing things which are resolved into dematerialized forms. When I was doing planning commissioner in New York, I made a huge mistake in that regard, which was we put resources. I'm thinking of a market we built and a school we built in the middle of Spanish Harlem, in the center of the community, where people were mostly with other people like themselves. And we should have moved both the market and the school just to the border between Spanish Harlem and the Upper East Side, which is one of the richest places in the world. It wouldn't have changed any politics in the national and ideological sense, but it would have changed biopolitics. That is, that somebody might use the same school as her maid, send their children to the same school, or God forbid, stand in the same line for a quart of milk, That kind of biopolitics is what cities are for, in my view. And it's why I think they're much more important than understanding what happens in Parliament, and so on.
Let me bring in an element of that then, and then this is from our last question that I have up here, and then Regan, I'll just get you to wrap up with a few comments of your own. This is from Joe Hoover, and Joe asks about the need on the subject of the need for flexible design, whether you could just say a little about how we achieve flexibility, in a democratic way, by which I know he's not pointing to parliaments necessarily, but to democratic, open, transparent, and fair forms of decision making and so forth.
Well, I'll tell you how I do it, and that's just the way I like to work. There are many other ways to do this. When I've worked on things like building a school, what I've done is create 3 or 4 alternative models for what the school could look like and how it could function. I've cut them out in styrofoam. I lay them out on trestle tables in a church or a meeting room. And because at the local level, people, most people, they're not designers, they don't know what things could be like. They see that there are alternatives, and each one of them has its pluses and minuses. I lay it out, and then I disappear. And that's where the democracy kicks in. There's no best solution. There are alternatives, and people are going to have to decide for themselves what they want. That's my version of democratic design. which based on the notion of the exit of expertise, using it to imagine, and then the exit of expertise. There are many other ways to do community planning, but I've done this ever since I started working for the UN. I worked this out working in Lebanon after the Civil War, and it works a treat because people want to say, well, which one should I do? And the answer is that I'm going to the cafe, you know, and that registers with people. Then they're empowered.
So there is a kind of ethics to this in a way, because, you know, and it comes out of Joe's point really, that, you know, that if you find ways to live flexibly, then you force the need for flexible systems of management, of expertise, of governance, and even at the end of the day of government. And I think that's the potential element of hope out of all of this, that a challenge like this forces us in a way
that is
to be, yeah.
That is the open city. So let's wrap up. I have to go back.
Regan, did you want to finish off with just a short comment, and then I'll close things out?
Yeah, well, I hope you can hear me, Richard. I've been fluctuating in and out, but okay, great. This distinction between mitigation and adaptation, I think, is one that it's really rich with food for thought as we start to think about returning to life back to normal, if that's possible, over the next few months, as we start to think about teaching our classes online, or developing perhaps less hierarchical but more remote structures for teaching. So I just want to say thank you for a stimulating conversation that's important to the present moment, but also for thinking about the kind of short and medium future. So I'll just end by saying thanks.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Regan. And thank you to Regan also for chairing and helping to chair and field questions. And thank you all in the audience for posing them. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to them all. Thank you above all, though, to Richard for sharing his insights with us.
I've never been to Queen Mary College, and I hope when we're free again to meet you in the flesh.
We'll make it a physical visit next time. And thanks to my colleague Nana Chuku, who's been supporting today's event. You can find out more about other upcoming events on our website, qmul.ac.uk/IHSS. And please note in particular our annual closing event next Thursday at 2 p.m. with Thomas Piketty, Heather Bushy, President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and Martin Sambu of the Financial Times. Until then, keep well and keep thinking.